Hey everyone, it's Monique and Tony once again here to do a vlog for the second time. Um, Today we're going to talk about the world's largest transgender archive housed at UVic's very own library. Specifically, we're going to be talking about some of the things we came across regarding the court case launched by Barbara Finley on behalf of Kimberly Nixon versus the Vancouver Rape Relief Society. We looked specifically at the amended petition to the court from June 2002 on behalf of the Vancouver Rape Relief Society. Now, just for a bit of background about this case, the website states that Finley represented Nixon, a trans woman who offered a volunteer work as a rape counselor, was refused by the Vancouver Rape Relief Society because Nixon was a transgender woman. Nixon then filed a human rights complaint alleging discrimination based on sex. Now, the case went through many levels of the court, but unfortunately, Kimberly Nixon lost. As by the time it made to the BC Court of Appeal, it was said that the rape relief was allowed to make its own determination of who was and who was not a woman. Therefore, the discrimination of her stood and was not protected under the Human Rights Code. So clearly there's a lot to deal with from this case, and specific document we looked at where the Vancouver Rape Relief Society was trying to explain their position, including what type of work they do, where the feminist and women liberation movement they stand, and why they decided that Kimberly Nixon was not eligible to aid other despite having herself been a survivor of sexual assault. So, Monique, what are your initial thoughts of this?
Well, as you said, there's a lot to talk about regarding this case, and I'd like to just start off with some of the more obvious points in terms of what the amended petition actually said. Now, in the petition, it said that Vancouver Rape Relief is a, quote, feminist service political group with certain fundamentals in place, such as consciousness raising and democratic practices. But really interestingly, they said that they would always locate women's liberation within the human struggle for freedom, yet they completely deny to do so, to identify women's liberation with human struggles for freedom in regards to a trans woman, Kimberly Nixon.
Yeah, to help with the section where they identify the political beliefs, it is interesting to contrast it with the later part of the document where Nixon's experience was recounted. In the document, you read that Nixon was told that Vancouver Rape Relief organizes among women responding to male violence against women, and Nixon had experience of being treated as a man in the world, and Cormier from the Vancouver Rape Relief did not. So she did not consider the two of them to be peers.
Yeah, contrasting these two sections is really interesting, especially considering that Vancouver Rape Relief identifies itself as a feminist organization, and I think that really brings me to the crux of the problem, which is where do trans men and women fit within feminism, especially a little bit of older strains of feminism, such as this one, which is coming out of the late 90s, early 2000s. I think this case really clearly illustrates a central problem within certain strands of feminism that seem to hinge on more essentialist understandings of gender. I mean, the very fact that someone can transition between the gender binary should point to the fluidity of gender, regardless of whether or not we agree with the binary in the first place in your American society. I also just find it ridiculous that another person feels that they have the right to tell someone else how to identify themselves and that their identity is invalid. I understand the sensitivity of the issue, especially surrounding rape crisis centers, yet at the same time the arguments used against Nixon by Cormier and the entirety of the Vancouver Rape Relief Society are ridiculous. The fact that she was treated as a man earlier in life should have nothing to do with her abilities to aid other survivors of sexual assault, especially considering she's a self-identified woman.
I agree. Also, it is a bit of a convoluted argument because they talk a lot about women appearing as women. So then does that mean that if a woman that was born with a female genitalia was treated as a man at one point in her life, perhaps someone confused her for a man or something like that, should she not be allowed to be a crisis volunteer?
Yeah, actually that's a really good point, and it brings us to another central aspect of what's going on in this case. How do we define gender? How do we define womanhood? Clearly, the Vancouver Rape Relief Society has a really strict definition of what it means to be a woman, based on certain conceptions of how female bodies and personalities should operate. And that's basically what they're telling Nixon. They're essentially telling her, you don't fit our categories of womanhood, and therefore you can't be a part of this feminist endeavor. Go find your own space.
Exactly. So the main problem here is that of categories. Who gets included, who gets excluded categories, and notion of identity plays a huge role in defining the in-group from the other. This is what Vancouver Relief Society is using as a legal argument that she's not a normal woman, and therefore could never understand the experience of the people they're trying to help. This despite the fact that she was sexually assaulted previously and had undergone therapy to deal with being a survivor. I feel as though this case really ties together a lot of the themes from the class that we have been discussing, especially surrounding who gets to be a feminist, who gets to define themselves, and who is willing to accept those definitions.
Definitely. I think that's a really good point to bring up, that this really does tie together a lot of the themes we've been dealing with in the class, like considering who is included and excluded in particular gender categories. And like you said, who gets to be a feminist and who gets to make these decisions of the in and the out groups, basically. I mean, this case touches on so much more than that, like the gendering of space and all these other aspects that we encounter in our daily lives, yet as cisgendered women or men, we often, it's an invisible barrier for us that we don't have to deal with. So yeah, thanks for listening to us.